Historically, inference is at its most powerful when independent lines of evidence can be integrated into a coherent account. Therefore, dating linguistics and cultural lineages can potentially play a vital role in the integration of evidence from linguistics and genetics, like the gene roots of Swahili language in the army. Across the globe, human existence accounts for more than 7,000 languages ever spoken or used to communicate. Sadly, in Africa, the core languages have been diluted by the evolving world with dominant cultures, languages and lifestyles taking root. The formula to dilute African languages was launched with the coming of foreigners on the African land in the 7th century, when Arabs first set foot in Africa for trade and business. Because they needed to communicate and negotiate, Swahili language was born. That's why it's a catalogue of words from various interland and coastal languages. A language for business that was later adopted as national language for the East African community and a basic component of the army.
Actually, Swahili in the army and its use is much older than UPDF or even the earlier Uganda armies, because Kiswahili arrived in Uganda much earlier, and by the time it came as a result of trade and business. The Arabs would come to East Africa in the interior until they reached Uganda, and in the course of doing so, they had no way they could communicate to us, language barrier, so they adopted Swahili, having begun from the coast. Moving, as they moved, people would learn Kiswahili and they begin to communicate with them.
This notwithstanding the deep question from deep in our history: when and how did Swahili language emerge and got adopted in the army?
During the colonial time, you realize that all the armies within the British East Africa, that is in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar then, were training in a place called Kapenguria. So all the colonial army, and they used to call it King African's Rifle, KAR. So when that is in Turkana region. So when they trained in the Turkana region in Kapenguria, the language of instruction was Kiswahili. So ideally, when the people came back home, those who had trained definitely came back when they would speak Kiswahili. And Kiswahili became the language of command.
The UPDF celebrates its 45th anniversary since the launch of the liberation struggle. Swahili remains a language of communication, a journey that was carried from colonial days, and a perfect recipe for communication.
After, of course, when countries got independence, but remember that most countries now started their training centers, but already Swahili had been identified as the language of the army, because you have a Muganda in the army, you have a Langi.
It was in 1902 when colonial masters found it prudent to build an army for its protectorate, an initiative that proved the need of people from different places, ethnicity and languages brought together in a group, one that carried the name of King African Rifles. Swahili met the qualification as the easiest means of communication, therefore adopted.
They began with a few of their soldiers from Britain, then they recruited from around, and again they picked on Kiswahili as a language to be used, because the people, they wanted to recruit the people, they wanted those people whom they had already been using, but all along, to reach out to the people, the lingua franca of Kiswahili had to be used. So as they began, there was, if I could take you to what was called King's African Rifle. In brief, it was KAR, KAR. And as they formed that army for security, for expansion, for protection of their interests.
The army, UPDF has evolved Swahili so much that it is still actually the language of parade. Yes. Even much as Kenya, they use Swahili, but their language of parade now is English. But in Swahili, in Uganda, the UPDF has maintained that.
Perplexed by why Swahili was opted for, we interrogated factors that led to the decision, because the colonial masters were high and strong for English.
Na wamemshinda mara zote tano, amejaribu mara tano, watu wa Chargonza wamemtoa APC 3. Kuna shida hiyo.
Why was Kiswahili used? Because it would unite different people, different tribes, different ethnic backgrounds, but most importantly, it was neutral. Then they used Kiswahili. Actually, Kiswahili originally was called Kikar. Ki is a prefix for language, so they were calling it Kikar, so that it is the language of King's African Rifles, and in so doing, Kiswahili was adapted all through. And when
Since then, the Army of Uganda has maintained Swahili as their official language, despite the several transformations and evolution trials the world has created over time. For example, in 1945, after the World War II, the Army's name was changed to African Rifles. Independence also meant that the Army's control was handed to Uganda as a state, and from regime to regime, the Army has carried through with Swahili in tandem.
Now, Swahili, when NRM came to power, they had liberation songs. Most of these liberation songs were in Swahili. So, and really there was mchaka mchaka. This is the political education for the masses, mass political education. The instructors, the songs sung were all in Swahili.
Remember, Amin himself was a recruit. Actually, he was serving under the King's African Rifles, a sergeant in the King's African Rifles, and so he came with what he knew and what he was, so that at the end of the day, that's how Kiswahili transformed into, from King's African Rifles into the Ugandan Army.
Uganda's constitution further cemented the Swahili language in Uganda, making it the second official language under Article 6, Clause 2. Consequently, during the Idi Amin regime, one who also served in the African Rifle as a sergeant, Swahili was made an official language in a decree declared in 1973. Surprisingly, Amin's decree has never been revoked by successive government, and it's perhaps the only order by Amin still standing to date.
After independence, we realized that in 1971, Amin takes over. And when Amin takes over in 1972-73, he passes a decree that Swahili is a national language. So when he passes a decree that Swahili is a national language, now that one gives Swahili now more status, from transiting from an army language now to a national what? To a national language, and really it spread very fast.
During this period, the language faced a blip among the citizens when Swahili-speaking soldiers became notorious during periods of political upheaval. Most Ugandans associated it with terror and brutality. Has this perception changed over the years?
Most of the lootings, most of the extrajudicial killings were being done by the armies then. And they were used, of course, given that Swahili was their language, and they were using Swahili. Number two, thieves, most of the thieves, especially armed robbers, most of them have a history of having been soldiers. And definitely when they are executing that, they use Swahili. So all that painted Swahili as really a language of the thugs.
Actions of the people that use the language can make it what people can bring about what people may feel as if the language is brutal, the language is oppressive, yet it is the people who use the language that can be that.
In Africa, between 150 and 200 million people use the language as both native and second language. This is why some organizations like the African Union are thinking of promoting and strengthening it for Africa's pride and identity.
So by and large in Uganda, we can credit the army for being a serious stakeholder in as far as the development and growth of Swahili is concerned.
Swahili is among the 10 most widely spoken languages in the world and continues to be carried by Uganda's army as the pride of the army, a feeling struck just by hearing men in uniform communicate using the Swahili language. Arafat Shafiq, NTV.
Tusonge, paka na jinga, hivyo leo.